Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Homecoming. The autumn wind cut through the mountains of West Virginia like a knife, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. Roman McKinney stood on the porch of his childhood home, his weathered hands gripping a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him to read the silence between sounds, and something in the air tonight felt wrong. Roman had built his life on discipline and loyalty. At 42, he was a decorated Special Forces operator with 20 years of service behind him. His body bore the scars of countless missions, a jagged line across his left shoulder from Kandahar, shrapnel marks on his forearms from Helmand Province. But the deepest wounds were invisible, carved by betrayal closer to home than any battlefield. The phone call had come 2 hours ago, pulling him from his temporary quarters at Fort Bragg, where he'd been preparing for his final deployment before retirement. Roman? This is Sheriff Saul Barr from Millfield County. The voice had been familiar. Saul had been 3 years ahead of Roman in high school, a linebacker who'd gone into law enforcement instead of the military. They'd shared beers and war stories whenever Roman came home on leave. "Soldier, we found your son's jacket by the old reservoir. Your wife claimed he ran away." The pause that followed had stretched like a taut wire. But a hunter saw her and her boyfriend drive him out there and leave him. "It's getting cold." Roman's jaw had tightened, his free hand unconsciously forming a fist. Luke McKinney was only 14, a quiet boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn streak. The idea of Regina, his wife of 16 years, abandoning their son in the wilderness was incomprehensible. "I'm telling the press he's a missing person," Saul had continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Her boyfriend is at the sawmill bar. You could teach him a lesson in your own style." Now, standing in the growing darkness, Roman replayed every word. Regina had been distant during his last leave 6 months ago, distracted and cold in ways that went beyond the usual strain of military marriages. She'd claimed it was stress from her job at the local insurance office, but Roman's instincts, honed by years of combat, had detected deception. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos of Luke. Fishing trips to Seneca Creek, hunting expeditions in the Monongahela Forest, quiet moments reading together on this very porch. The boy was everything to Roman. The future he'd been fighting to protect. The reason he'd endured 3 deployments in a decade. Roman's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Your boy's tough. Found him half frozen by Miller's Cave. He's safe. S.B." Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by rage. Regina hadn't just betrayed their marriage. She'd endangered their child. The woman he'd loved since high school, the one he'd married in the little chapel on Maple Street, had crossed a line from which there could be no return. He walked back into the house, his footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The McKinney family had owned this property for 3 generations. Roman's grandfather had built the main structure in 1952, a solid 2-story frame house with a wraparound porch and a view of the valley below. Roman's father had added the workshop and garage, teaching his son the value of working with his hands between deployments to Korea and Vietnam. Roman made his way to the basement, where his father's gun safe stood in the corner like a metal monument to preparedness. Inside were the tools of his trade: a Remington 700 sniper rifle, a modified AR-15, 2 Glock pistols, and various other implements acquired over 2 decades of service. But tonight, he reached for something simpler, a tactical knife his unit had given him after his second tour, engraved with the Special Forces motto, De Oppresso Liber, to liberate the oppressed. He'd spent years liberating strangers from tyranny. Now it was time to liberate himself from betrayal. Roman's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Regina McKinney. "Where are you?" Her voice was sharp with false concern. "Luke's missing. We need to—" "I know." Roman's voice was flat, emotionless. "I'm coming home. Roman, He ended the call and turned off the phone. Whatever Regina McKinney had to say, she could save it for the reckoning that was coming. Chapter 2. The Unraveling. The drive from West Virginia to Millfield took Roman through winding mountain roads he'd traveled countless times as a boy. Each turn brought back memories. Summers spent hunting with his father, fishing trips with his grandfather, high school dates with Regina before the world got complicated. But tonight, the familiar landscape felt foreign, tainted by the knowledge of what waited at the end of the journey. Roman's mind worked like a tactical computer, processing information and formulating plans. He'd learned long ago that successful operations required intelligence, patience, and the will to see things through to their logical conclusion. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when his son's safety hung in the balance. He pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, a 24-hour truck stop where he'd worked summers during high school. The neon sign flickered against the night sky, casting red and blue shadows across the pavement. Inside, he spotted a familiar figure hunched over a cup of coffee in a corner booth. Sheriff Saul Barr looked up as Roman approached. At 45, Saul had the weathered face of a man who'd seen too much small-town darkness. His uniform was rumpled, his badge reflecting the diner's fluorescent lights. "Roman." Saul stood and extended his hand. "Good to see you, though I wish it was under different circumstances." They sat across from each other, two middle-aged men bound by shared history and mutual respect. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, brought Roman coffee without being asked. "Tell me everything," Roman said. Saul pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages covered in his careful handwriting. "Hunter named Chester Durham, ironic considering, found Luke around midnight near Miller's Cave. Kid was hypothermic, scared out of his mind. Durham brought him to the hospital, where Dr. Cora Ortega treated him for exposure." Roman's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "Chester Durham? Regina's boyfriend." Saul's voice carried the weight of distaste. "Been seeing him for about 4 months, according to local gossip. He works part-time at the sawmill, part-time as a hunting guide. Real piece of work, 2 DUIs, history of domestic violence with his ex-wife." The irony wasn't lost on Roman. The man who'd found Luke was apparently the same man who'd helped abandon him. Either Chester Durham had a sudden attack of conscience, or something more complicated was at play. "What's Luke saying?" Saul's expression darkened. "Not much. He's traumatized, Roman. Keeps asking for you. Won't say a word about how he ended up out there. Dr. Ortega says he's physically fine, but psychologically." He shrugged. "Kid needs his father. Where is he now?" "Safe house. My sister Teresa runs a youth shelter 2 counties over. I figured it was better than leaving him with Regina, considering." Roman nodded, grateful for his old friend's foresight. "And Regina?" Playing the concerned mother for the cameras. Local news picked up the story. "Military father returns to search for missing son." "She's got the whole town convinced you're some kind of absentee father who abandoned his family for the war." The familiar burn of injustice rose in Roman's chest. He'd given 16 years to his country, missing birthdays and holidays and school plays to serve something larger than himself. Now Regina was using his sacrifice as a weapon against him. "There's more," Saul continued. "I did some digging on Durham. He's not just some random drifter. Turns out he's Regina's cousin, second cousin, but still family. They've known each other since childhood." This information shifted everything. Roman had assumed Regina's affair was a recent development, born of loneliness and poor judgment. But if she had history with Durham, if this betrayal had deeper roots, met his friend's gaze steadily. "I'm not planning to disappear anyone, Saul. I'm planning to expose the truth." "And how exactly do you intend to do that?" Roman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The same way I've handled every mission for the past 20 years. Carefully." Chapter 3. Reconnaissance. The McKinney house sat on 5 acres of wooded land outside Millfield's town limits, a 2-story colonial that Roman had bought with his deployment bonuses and VA loan benefits. As he pulled into the gravel driveway, he could see Regina's car, a red Honda Civic he'd given her for their 10th anniversary, parked beside a black pickup truck he didn't recognize. Roman sat in his truck for a moment, studying the scene like a sniper calculating wind speed and distance. The house looked the same from the outside. White vinyl siding, green shutters, the tire swing he'd hung from the old oak tree for Luke's 8th birthday. But knowing what he knew now, it felt like enemy territory. He approached the front door with practiced silence, his military training allowing him to move without disturbing the dried leaves scattered across the porch. Through the living room window, he could hear voices, Regina soprano mixed with a deeper male tone he assumed belonged to Chester Durham. "Told you this would happen," Regina was saying, her voice tight with stress. "I told you he'd come back, and now look at the mess we're in. Relax, Reggie." Durham's voice carried the lazy confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences. "Your husband's been gone for months. What's he going to do, anyway? File for divorce? You'll get half of everything, plus alimony and child support." Roman pressed himself against the wall beside the window, using techniques he'd learned for urban reconnaissance. From this angle, he could see into the living room without being spotted. Regina McKinney stood by the fireplace, still beautiful at 38, but harder somehow, her blonde hair shorter than Roman remembered and her clothes more expensive than their budget should have allowed. Chester Durham lounged on the couch Roman had bought last Christmas, a big man with prematurely gray hair and the soft look of someone who'd never pushed himself beyond comfort. "You don't understand," Regina said, pacing like a caged animal. "Roman's not like other men. He's intense, focused. When he sets his mind to something, he doesn't let go." Durham laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "What's he going to do? He's a soldier, not a detective. Besides, Luke can't prove anything. Kid was half frozen when I found him. Probably doesn't even remember how he got there." Roman's blood turned to ice. Durham had been the one to find Luke, but from the conversation, it sounded like he'd also been involved in abandoning him. The man was playing both sides, the concerned citizen who'd rescued the boy and the conspirator who'd helped endanger him in the first place. "That's not the point," Regina snapped. "The point is that Roman will start asking questions, and when he does, we stick to the story. Luke ran away because he was upset about his parents' marriage falling apart. You searched for him, called the police, played the worried mother. Durham found him during a hunting trip and brought him to safety. End of story." Regina shook her head. "You don't know him like I do. Roman's smart, Chester. Smarter than both of us put together. If he suspects something, then we'll deal with it." Durham stood and moved toward Regina, his hands settling on her shoulders in a gesture that was meant to be comforting but looked possessive to Roman's trained eye. "Look, we've come too far to back down now. The insurance policy alone will set us up for life." Insurance policy. Roman's mind raced, connecting dots he hadn't even known existed. Regina worked for Millfield Insurance, had worked there for 8 years, handling claims and policies for half the county. What kind of insurance policy were they talking about? "The accidental death benefit is $500,000, Regina said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But only if it looks like an accident. If there's any suspicion, any investigation." Roman's world tilted on its axis. They weren't just talking about divorce or even abandoning Luke in the wilderness. They were planning to kill him, to make it look like an accident and collect on his life insurance policy. "The hunting trip is perfect," Durham continued. "Tragic accident in the mountains, experienced soldier caught off guard by the weather. It happens all the time. And Luke," Durham shrugged, "kid will be traumatized by losing his father so soon after getting lost. Natural that he'd want to stay with his mother instead of being shipped off to some relative he barely knows." Roman had heard enough. He backed away from the window with the same silent precision he'd used to approach, his mind already formulating a plan. Regina and Durham thought they were setting a trap for him, but they'd just revealed their hand to the one person capable of turning their scheme against them. As he reached his truck, Roman's phone buzzed with a text message. The number was local, but not in his contacts. "Your wife's planning something. Meet me at the old covered bridge tomorrow at noon. Come alone. A friend." Roman stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it. In his experience, anonymous tips were either traps or desperate cries for help. Either way, they required careful investigation. He started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, his headlights sweeping across the house where he'd once believed he had a future. That man, the one who'd trusted blindly and loved completely, was dead. What remained was a soldier with a mission: to protect his son and make his enemies pay for their betrayal. The war had finally come home. Chapter 4. The Network. Roman spent the night in a motel on the outskirts of Millfield, a rundown establishment that catered to truckers and travelers who valued anonymity over comfort. He'd checked in under the name John Frederick, one of several false identities he developed during his intelligence training, and paid cash for a week in advance. The room was spartiate but functional. A single bed, a small table, and a bathroom with fixtures that had seen better decades. Roman didn't need luxury. He needed a base of operations where he could plan without interference. He spread Luke's school photos across the table, studying his son's face for clues he might have missed. In the most recent picture, taken just before Roman's deployment 8 months ago, Luke's smile seemed forced, his eyes holding a wariness that hadn't been there before. How long had Regina been planning this? How long had his son been living in a house where his mother and her lover discussed murdering his father? At 0600 hours, Roman drove to the covered bridge mentioned in the mysterious text message. The structure dated to the 1890s, a wooden span that crossed Seneca Creek at its narrowest point. Local legend claimed it was haunted by the ghost of a Civil War soldier, though Roman had never seen anything more supernatural than teenagers drinking beer and carving their initials into the weathered planks. He arrived early, positioning himself in the tree-line with a clear view of both approaches to the bridge. Military training had taught him that meetings with unknown parties required preparation and multiple exit strategies. At exactly noon, a figure emerged from the opposite end of the bridge. Roman recognized her immediately, Dr. Cora Ortega, the physician who'd treated Luke. She was a small woman in her early 40s, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Roman had met her twice before, once when Luke broke his arm falling from a tree, and again during a routine physical before one of Roman's deployments. Roman emerged from the tree-line as Dr. Ortega reached the center of the bridge. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd get my message." "Dr. Ortega." Roman nodded respectfully. "I assume this is about Luke." Among other things, she glanced around nervously, as if expecting to be overheard. "Roman, I need to tell you something about the night your son was brought to the hospital. Something that doesn't add up." Roman waited, his expression neutral. In his experience, people revealed more when they weren't prompted. Chester Durham brought Luke in around 12:30 a.m. Dr. Ortega continued. Claimed he found the boy near Miller's Cave during a late-night hunting trip. But here's the thing. Luke's injuries weren't consistent with someone who'd been lost in the wilderness for hours. Explain. The hypothermia was real but mild. His core temperature was only down to 94 degrees. Uncomfortable but not life-threatening. More importantly, he had marks on his wrists and ankles. Rope burns hidden under his clothes. Roman's jaw tightened. Someone tied him up. That's what I thought. But when I tried to ask Luke about it, he became agitated. Kept saying he couldn't remember, that everything was dark and cold. Then Regina arrived, and suddenly Luke wouldn't say anything at all. Dr. Ortega reached in her jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. I took pictures of the marks before Regina arrived. Officially, they're not in Luke's medical file. I documented them as minor abrasions consistent with outdoor exposure. But I kept copies because something felt wrong. Roman opened the envelope and examined the photographs. The rope burns were clear and distinctive, showing a pattern consistent with restraints rather than accidental contact. Someone had tied his son up and left him in the wilderness to die. There's more, Dr. Ortega said. I've been thinking about this for days, and I remembered something. About 6 months ago, Regina came to see me. Said she was having trouble sleeping, wanted a prescription for anxiety medication. During the consultation, she asked some unusual questions. What kind of questions? Medical questions about hypothermia. How long it would take someone to die from exposure, what the symptoms would look like, whether there would be any obvious signs of foul play. I thought it was academic curiosity, morbid fascination with medical conditions. But now, Roman studied the doctor's face, reading the genuine concern in her eyes. Dr. Ortega was risking her career by sharing this information, motivated by nothing more than a desire to protect a child. It was exactly the kind of moral courage Roman had come to value during his years of service. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because Luke is my patient, and his welfare is my responsibility. But also because—" She hesitated, then forged ahead. "Because Regina tried to convince me to sign a death certificate without an autopsy." "What?" "2 days ago. She came to my office, supposedly to thank me for treating Luke. But during the conversation, she mentioned how difficult it would be if something happened to you, how traumatic an autopsy would be for the family, how much simpler it would be if a doctor who knew the family could just sign the certificate based on obvious circumstances." Roman felt the familiar coldness that preceded combat operations. Regina wasn't just planning his death. She was already preparing to cover it up. "Dr. Ortega, I need you to do something for me," he said. "I need you to keep those photographs safe, and I need you to document everything Regina said to you. If something happens to me, make sure Sheriff Barr gets that information. Roman, if you're in danger, why don't you just leave? Take Luke and start over somewhere else." Roman shook his head. "Because they'll follow us. And because running away doesn't solve the problem, it just delays it. Regina and Durham have crossed a line. They've involved my son in their scheme, and they're planning to murder me for money. That's not something I can forgive or forget." Dr. Ortega studied his face, perhaps recognizing something in his expression that reminded her why soldiers were trained differently from civilians. "What are you going to do?" "Well, I've always done," Roman replied. "Complete the mission." Chapter 5. The Hunter and the Hunted. Roman spent the afternoon conducting surveillance on Chester Durham, following him from the sawmill to Murphy's Diner to a ramshackle trailer park on the wrong side of Millfield. Durham lived in a double-wide mobile home that had seen better decades, surrounded by the detritus of a life lived without ambition or accountability. From his position in the tree lean, Roman observed Durham's routine with the patience of a sniper. The man drank beer on his sagging porch, made phone calls while pacing around his yard, and seemed generally agitated in the way of someone whose plans weren't proceeding smoothly. At 1800 hours, Durham's phone rang. Roman was too far away to hear the conversation, but he could read body language. Durham's posture straightened, his voice became animated, and he began gesturing as if arguing with the caller. When the call ended, Durham went inside and emerged 15 minutes later wearing hunting clothes and carrying a rifle case. Roman followed at a distance as Durham drove his black pickup into the mountains, using logging roads that wound deeper into the Monongahela National Forest. The terrain was familiar to Roman from childhood hunting trips with his father and grandfather. These mountains held 1,000 hiding places, 1,000 ways for a man to disappear forever. Durham's truck turned into a clearing Roman recognized, Miller's Hollow, a hunting camp used by local sportsmen during deer season. The camp consisted of a small cabin, an equipment shed, and a clearing large enough for vehicles and camping gear. More importantly, it was the closest road access to Miller's Cave, where Luke had supposedly been found. Roman parked his truck on a forestry road half a mile away and proceeded on foot, using game trails and natural cover to approach the camp unseen. His military training served him well in these mountains. The skills that had kept him alive in Afghan valleys translated perfectly to West Virginia wilderness. As he drew closer, Roman could see Durham setting up what appeared to be a hunting blind near the cabin. But this wasn't deer season, and Durham's positioning suggested he was expecting human prey rather than wildlife. Roman's phone vibrated with a text message. "Change of plans. Meet at Miller's Hollow at 2000 hours. Come alone. We need to talk. Regina." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place. Regina was luring him to the exact spot where Durham was preparing an ambush. They'd planned this carefully, the concerned wife asking her estranged husband to meet for a reconciliation. The tragic hunting accident when a stray bullet found its target in the darkness. Roman smiled grimly. They'd made a fundamental error in assuming he would approach their trap with civilian caution rather than military precision. He circled the camp, noting sight lines and escape routes, identifying Durham's position and likely fields of fire. The hunting blind overlooked the clearing where vehicles would park, with additional cover behind the cabin and equipment shed. It was a competent ambush site for dealing with unsuspecting prey. Unfortunately for Durham, Roman McKinney was neither unsuspecting nor prey. Roman positioned himself on high ground overlooking the camp, settling into a sniper's hide he'd constructed from fallen logs and natural camouflage. From this position, he had clear sight lines to both the hunting blind and the access road. More importantly, he could observe without being observed. At 1930 hours, Regina's red Honda appeared on the logging road, headlights cutting through the growing darkness. She parked near the cabin and stepped out, wearing jeans and a heavy jacket that seemed inappropriate for a reconciliation meeting. Roman noted the bulge in her right jacket pocket, likely a pistol, though he couldn't be certain from this distance. Regina walked to the center of the clearing and checked her phone, presumably texting Roman to confirm he was coming. She seemed nervous, glancing frequently toward Durham's concealed position and the surrounding tree line. At exactly 2000 hours, Roman sent his own text message. "I'm here, but not where you think." Regina's phone buzzed, and Roman watched her read the message through his rifle scope. Her reaction was immediate. Confusion followed by growing alarm as she realized their plan had been compromised. Durham emerged from his hiding place, rifle in hand, scanning the darkness with the desperate intensity of a man who just realized he was outmatched. "Where is he?" Durham called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I don't know," Regina replied, panic creeping into her voice. "He said he's here, but—" Roman's voice cut through the night air, amplified by a small megaphone he'd brought from his tactical gear. "I'm here, Regina. Right where you wanted me to be." Both conspirators spun toward the sound, but Roman had positioned himself to create an acoustic illusion. His voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once, a psychological warfare technique he'd learned during urban combat training. "Let's talk about Luke," Roman continued, his voice echoing off the surrounding hills. "Let's talk about how you tied up my son and left him to die in these mountains. Let's talk about the insurance policy you're planning to collect after your hunting accident goes wrong." Regina and Durham exchanged panic glances, their carefully orchestrated plan crumbling in real time. "Let's talk about how this ends," Roman concluded, and the threat in his voice was unmistakable. Chapter 6. Confession in the Dark. "Roman, please." Regina's voice cracked as she called out to the darkness. "Let me explain. This isn't what you think." From his concealed position, Roman watched the two conspirators huddle together near Regina's car, their body language revealing the depth of their panic. Durham clutched his rifle with white knuckles, swinging it back and forth as he tried to locate a target in the shadows. Regina pressed close to her lover, one hand on his arm, as if seeking protection from the husband she'd betrayed. "Then explain it." Roman's voice echoed from the hills, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Explain why my son had rope burns on his wrists. Explain why you asked Dr. Ortega about hypothermia 6 months ago. Explain the insurance policy." Durham's nerve broke first. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice high with stress. "We're leaving." He grabbed Regina's arm and started pulling her toward the car. Roman's next transmission stopped them cold. "Chester Durham. 2 DUIs, domestic violence conviction. Assault charges dropped when your ex-wife Tammy Crawford refused to testify. Currently unemployed, except for part-time work as a hunting guide and occasional shifts at Morrison Sawmill. Living in a trailer owned by your cousin Antonia Banks. Behind on rent for 3 months. Durham released Regina's arm, his face pale in the moonlight. "How do you? I know a lot of things, Chester. I know you and Regina have been planning this for months. I know you convinced her that killing me was the only way to access my life insurance. I know you're both stupid enough to think you could get away with it." Regina stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Roman, stop this. We never meant for Luke to get hurt. That was an accident." "An accident?" Roman's voice carried the cold precision of a man rendering judgment. "You tied up a 14-year-old boy and left him in the wilderness overnight. You were willing to let him die to cover your tracks." "No." Regina's protest was desperate now. "We just needed him out of the way for one night." We were going to come back for him after you murdered me. Roman's statement hung in the air like a physical weight. Durham raised his rifle, scanning the tree line with desperate intensity. Show yourself, you coward. Face me like a man. Roman's laughter was harsh and without humor. A man? You want to talk about being a man, Chester? A man doesn't prey on children. A man doesn't seduce another man's wife while he's serving his country. A man doesn't plan murder for insurance money. We didn't have a choice. Regina cried out. You were never here, Roman. Always deployed, always putting the army first. I was lonely, and Chester was. Chester was using you, Roman interrupted. Just like he used his ex-wife before she finally got smart enough to leave him. Just like he's used every woman who was foolish enough to trust him. Durham's face twisted with rage. You don't know anything about us. Regina loves me. We're going to be together. Are you? Roman's voice carried a note of amusement. Tell me, Regina, has Chester mentioned his other girlfriend? The one in Beckley he visits every Thursday when he tells you he's working late at the sawmill? Regina turned to stare at Durham, confusion and hurt flickering across her face. What is he talking about? Durham's grip on his rifle wavered. He's lying, Reggie, trying to turn us against each other. Her name is Brooke Beck, Roman continued relentlessly. Bartender at the Mountaineer Tavern. 3 years younger than you. No children, no complications. He's been telling her the same lies he's been telling you. About leaving his current situation, starting over, building a life together. Chester. Regina's voice was small now, vulnerable in a way that made Roman remember the girl he'd fallen in love with 20 years ago. Durham spun toward her, his face desperate. Don't listen to him. He's trying to manipulate you. Like you manipulated her into betraying her husband and endangering her son. Roman's voice cut through Durham's protests. Like you manipulated her into thinking murder was the answer to her problems? Regina backed away from Durham, the full weight of her situation finally becoming clear. She betrayed everything that mattered for a man who'd been betraying her in return. I want to see Luke, she whispered. I want to see my son. Your son is safe, Roman replied. Safer than he's been in months. But whether you ever see him again depends on what happens in the next few minutes. Durham raised his rifle toward the sound of Roman's voice. Enough of this. Come out and face me, or I start shooting. Go ahead. Roman's voice was calm, almost conversational. Fire into the darkness at a target you can't see. Waste your ammunition on shadows and echoes. But remember, every shot you take tells me exactly where you are. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind in the trees and Durham's labored breathing. Roman could see the man's internal struggle, the desperate desire to fight warring with a growing realization that he was hopelessly outmatched. Here's what's going to happen, Roman continued. You're going to put down the rifle and walk to the center of the clearing. Both of you. And then you're going to tell me exactly how this was supposed to work. Every detail, every contingency, every lie you plan to tell. And if we don't, Durham's defiance was hollow now. The bravado of a man who'd run out of options. Roman's reply was quiet but carried the weight of absolute certainty. Then neither of you leaves these mountains alive. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The confession came in pieces, extracted from Regina and Durham like shrapnel from a wound. They sat in the dirt of the clearing, hands visible, while Roman remained concealed in the darkness above them. His voice served as judge and prosecutor, patient and relentless in equal measure. Start from the beginning, Roman commanded. When did this start? Regina's voice was barely above a whisper. Last spring, after you left for your deployment. I was angry, tired of being alone all the time, tired of explaining to Luke why his father was never around for the important things. So you called your cousin. It wasn't like that. The protest was automatic but weak. Chester came to town for Grandma McKinney's funeral. We started talking, remembering old times. Durham shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Roman could see the calculation in the man's eyes, wondering if cooperation might lead to mercy, not understanding that some betrayals put you beyond redemption. Tell him about the money, Roman said. The life insurance policy was always there, Regina continued. $500,000, double indemnity for accidental death. I never thought about it until Chester suggested it. Durham finally spoke up. She was drowning in debt, Roman. Credit cards, medical bills from when Luke broke his arm, mortgage payments she couldn't handle on her salary. The insurance was just sitting there. So you convinced her that murder was a better option than bankruptcy. It wasn't supposed to be murder. Regina's voice cracked. Chester said we could make it look like an accident. A hunting mishap, something that happened while you were out in the woods alone. No one would question it. Everyone knows soldiers sometimes have problems when they come back. Roman's voice turned deadly quiet. Problems. PTSD, Durham said, taking over the narrative. Veteran suicide rates, accidental shootings, risky behavior in the wilderness. We figure people would assume you'd either killed yourself or died because your military training made you overconfident in dangerous situations. And Luke. Regina's composure finally shattered completely. Luke was never supposed to be hurt. We just needed him out of the house that night, somewhere safe where he couldn't witness what happened or contradict our story. So you tied him up and left him in the wilderness. We were going to come back. Regina sobbed. After everything was over, Chester was going to find him during a search. Luke would have been cold and scared, but safe. He would have been the traumatized son who lost his father, deserving of sympathy and support. Roman processed this information with the clinical detachment of an intelligence analyst. The plan had a brutal efficiency to it. Eliminate the husband, traumatize the child into compliance, collect the insurance money, and disappear into a new life funded by blood and betrayal. What went wrong? Durham answered this time. Luke fought harder than we expected, got loose from the ropes somehow, and started making noise. We had to relocate him deeper in the cave system, tie him up again with better knots. By the time we finished, it was too late to implement the rest of the plan. So you decided to wait. We were going to try again the next night, Regina admitted. But then Luke got hypothermic faster than we anticipated. Chester panicked and brought him to the hospital before we could complete the operation. Roman felt a cold satisfaction at learning his enemy's weakness. They'd failed because they were amateurs, cruel enough to conceive a plan, but too incompetent to execute it properly. That incompetence had saved both Luke's life and his own. The anonymous tip, Roman said. Who sent it? Regina and Durham exchanged glances. What tip? Regina asked. Interesting. Someone else was involved in this situation, someone with enough awareness to warn Roman, but not enough courage to come forward directly. Roman filed that information away for later investigation. Here's what happens next, Roman announced. Chester, you're going to walk to your truck and drive away. You're going to keep driving until you're out of West Virginia, and you're never going to come back. Durham struggled to his feet, hope flickering in his eyes. And that's it? You let me go. I said you were going to drive away. I didn't say you were going to make it to the state line. The hope died instantly. Durham understood that Roman wasn't offering mercy. He was offering a head start in a hunt that would end only one way. Regina, you're going to get in your car and drive to the sheriff's office. You're going to confess everything, the affair, the insurance scheme, what you did to Luke. You're going to take full responsibility and cooperate completely with the investigation. Roman, please. The alternative is that I handle this my way without involving the legal system. And my way doesn't include trials or appeals or the possibility of parole. Regina nodded through her tears, understanding that she was being offered the only chance at survival she was likely to receive. One more thing, Roman added. If either of you ever contacts Luke again, if you ever come within 100 miles of him, if you ever speak his name to another living soul, I will find you. And when I do, what happens next will make tonight look like a friendly conversation. Durham was already backing toward his truck, his rifle forgotten in his haste to escape. Regina remained seated in the dirt, her face buried in her hands. Go, Roman commanded. Both of you. Now, as the two vehicles disappeared down the mountain road, Roman emerged from his concealment for the first time that night. The clearing seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the absence of the people who'd tried to turn it into his grave. He picked up Durham's abandoned rifle and ejected the chambered round, studying the cartridge in the moonlight. a .30-06 hunting round, perfectly legal, readily available, and capable of killing a man at considerable distance. It would have been the bullet that ended his life if he'd approached this meeting with trust instead of suspicion. Roman pocketed the cartridge as evidence and began the methodical process of clearing the scene. There would be no physical proof that tonight's confrontation had ever taken place. When the authorities found Chester Durham's truck wrapped around a tree on Highway 9, it would appear to be a single vehicle accident caused by excessive speed and alcohol consumption. When Regina McKinney confessed to attempted murder and child endangerment, there would be no corroborating evidence except her own words. The war was over, but the victory belonged to the soldier who'd learned long ago that the only unforgivable sin was leaving enemies alive to threaten what you loved. Chapter 8. Loose Ends. Roman found Chester Durham's black pickup truck 3 miles down Highway 9, wrapped around a massive oak tree with the kind of violence that suggested excessive speed and a complete loss of control. The impact had been so severe that the engine block had been driven into the cab, making survival impossible for anyone not wearing a seatbelt, which Durham hadn't been wearing, according to the evidence Roman had carefully arranged. The empty beer bottles scattered around the wreckage told their own story. A man drinking heavily while driving dangerous mountain roads, his judgment impaired by alcohol and desperation. The investigating officers would find Durham's blood alcohol level well above the legal limit, thanks to the whiskey Roman had forced down the unconscious man's throat before positioning him behind the wheel. It was a textbook single-vehicle fatality, the kind that happened with tragic regularity on West Virginia's winding mountain highways. No witnesses, no suspicious circumstances, no reason for anyone to question the obvious explanation. Roman stood in the tree lane watching the emergency responders work, their flashing lights painting the crash scene in alternating red and blue. Sheriff Saul Barr moved through the wreckage with the methodical precision of a man who'd seen too many similar scenes, documenting everything for a report that would be filed and forgotten within a month. Roman's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Justice has been served. Thank you. A friend. This time, Roman didn't delete the message. Someone had been watching tonight's events unfold, someone with enough knowledge to understand what had really happened. Roman needed to identify this unknown ally before closing the final chapter of his revenge. He made his way back to his truck and drove to the Millfield County Sheriff's Office, arriving just as Regina's red Honda pulled into the parking lot. Through his windshield, he could see her sitting behind the wheel, gathering the courage to walk inside and confess to crimes that would destroy her life. Roman waited in the darkness, watching his wife of 16 years prepare to face the consequences of her betrayal. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her guilt and the knowledge of what she'd lost. The woman who'd once been the center of his universe had become a stranger, someone capable of endangering their child for money and revenge. Regina finally emerged from her car and walked toward the sheriff's office entrance, her steps slow and reluctant. She paused at the door, turned to look back at the parking lot as if sensing Roman's presence, then disappeared inside the building. Roman didn't follow. He had no desire to witness Regina's confession or to see her taken into custody. That chapter of his life was over, closed as definitively as Chester Durham's had been on Highway 9. Instead, he drove to the youth shelter where Luke was staying, a converted Victorian house that served as a temporary refuge for children in crisis. The facility was run by Teresa Stevenson, Sheriff Barr's sister, a former social worker who dedicated her life to protecting kids from the failures of the adults who were supposed to love them. Roman parked outside and sat for a moment, preparing himself for the most important conversation of his life. Luke had been through trauma that no child should endure. Abandoned by his mother, used as a pawn in a murder plot, forced to confront the reality that the people he trusted most had been willing to sacrifice him for money. The front porch light came on as Roman approached the house, and Teresa appeared in the doorway. She was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering but hadn't lost their compassion. "Roman," she said softly, "Luke's been waiting for you. How is he? Physically? He's fine. Emotionally?" She shrugged. "He's a strong kid. but what he's been through would break most adults. He knows something terrible almost happened, even if he doesn't understand all the details. Teresa led Roman through the house to a small sitting room where Luke sat reading a paperback novel. The boy looked up as his father entered, and Roman felt his heart break at the mixture of relief and wariness in his son's eyes. "Dad." Luke's voice was carefully neutral, the tone of someone who'd learned not to trust completely. "Hey, buddy." Roman sat in the chair across from his son, studying the face that was so much like his own at that age. "How are you feeling?" Confused, Luke admitted. "Mom said you were coming home to take me away from her. Said you blamed her for what happened to me in the mountains. But Sheriff Barr says she's the one who hurt me." Roman chose his words carefully. "Your mother made some very bad choices, Luke. Choices that put you in danger and nearly destroyed our family. But that doesn't mean she doesn't love you. Then why did she do it?" It was the question Roman had been dreading, because the honest answer was too complex and too painful for a 14-year-old to fully understand. How could he explain that love sometimes turned into something twisted and selfish? How could he help his son comprehend that the woman who'd given birth to him had been willing to sacrifice him for money? "People sometimes do terrible things when they're scared or desperate," Roman said finally. "Your mother thought she was trapped in a situation she couldn't escape from, and she made choices that seemed logical to her at the time. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it might help explain it." Luke nodded slowly, processing this information with the careful consideration of someone who'd been forced to grow up too quickly. "What happens now?" the boy asked. "Now we start over," Roman replied. "Just you and me, somewhere far from here. I'm retiring from the army, and we're going to find a place where we can build a new life together." "What about Mom?" Roman met his son's eyes directly. "Your mother's going to prison, Luke. For a very long time. What she did to you, what she planned to do to me, those are serious crimes with serious consequences." Luke was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up again, there were tears in his eyes, but also something that looked like relief. "I'm glad you're okay, Dad. When they left me in that cave, I thought I'd never see you again." Roman moved to the couch and pulled his son into a fierce embrace, feeling the boy's tears soak into his shirt. They sat that way for a long time, father and son mourning the family they'd lost while finding strength in what remained. "I love you, Luke," Roman whispered. "And I promise you, nothing like this will ever happen again. I'll never let anyone hurt you again." "I know," Luke replied, and Roman heard the absolute trust in his son's voice. It was a trust he'd earned through years of keeping his promises, and one he intended to honor for the rest of his life. Outside, the autumn wind carried the sound of sirens as emergency responders finished cleaning up Chester Durham's final mistake. But inside the shelter, a father and son began the long process of healing from betrayal and building something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. Chapter 9. New Beginnings. 6 months later, Roman McKinney stood on the deck of a cabin overlooking Lake Tahoe, watching his son cast a fishing line into the clear mountain water. The California sun was warm on his face, a welcome change from the cold mountains of West Virginia and the memories they held. Luke had grown 3 inches since they'd left Millfield, filling out with the rapid development of adolescence. More importantly, the wariness had faded from his eyes, replaced by the natural confidence of a boy who knew his father would protect him from anything. Roman's phone buzzed with a text message from Sheriff Saul Barr. Regina pleaded guilty to attempted murder and child endangerment. 25 years minimum. Thought you should know. Roman deleted the message without replying. Regina McKinney was part of a past he'd left behind, a cautionary tale about the price of betrayal and the consequences of choosing weakness over loyalty. "Dad," Luke called from the dock. "I think I've got something." Roman walked down to help his son reel in what turned out to be a respectable rainbow trout, the fish fighting hard before surrendering to superior strategy and patience. They released it back into the lake, watching it disappear into the depths with a flash of silver scales. "Think we should head back?" Luke asked, checking his watch. "Dr. Martinez said she wanted to see you at 3. Dr. Elena Martinez was Luke's therapist, a skilled professional who'd helped the boy process the trauma of his mother's betrayal without losing his capacity for trust. The sessions had been difficult at first. Luke had been reluctant to discuss what had happened, afraid that talking about it would somehow make it real again. But Dr. Martinez had patience and skill, and gradually Luke had begun to open up about his experiences. Roman attended every session, learning how to recognize the signs of anxiety and depression, how to provide support without being overprotective, how to help his son heal without rushing the process. Actually, Roman said, Dr. Martinez wanted to see both of us today. She says you're making excellent progress. They walked back to the cabin, a modest 3-bedroom structure Roman had purchased with cash from his military savings and retirement benefits. It was isolated enough to provide privacy, but close enough to town that Luke could attend the local high school and participate in normal teenage activities. Roman had enrolled Luke in martial arts classes and wilderness survival courses, teaching him skills that would build confidence and self-reliance. The boy showed natural aptitude for both, approaching each challenge with a methodical determination he'd inherited from his father. At Dr. Martinez's office, Luke settled into his usual chair while Roman took the seat beside him. The therapist was a woman in her 40s with warm eyes and an easy manner that put even reluctant patients at ease. Luke's been telling me about the fishing trip you're planning, Dr. Martinez began. Alaska, isn't it? 2 weeks on the Kenai Peninsula, Roman confirmed. Fishing, hiking, camping under the stars. Luke's been researching the area for months. It sounds wonderful. Luke, how do you feel about spending that much time in the wilderness? Luke considered the question seriously. Excited, he said finally, I know Dad won't let anything happen to me, and I want to prove to myself that I'm not afraid of being outside anymore. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. That's a very mature attitude. Roman, do you have any concerns about the trip? Only that Luke might catch a bigger salmon than I do, Roman replied, earning a laugh from his son. After the session, they drove into town for supplies, stopping at the hardware store for camping gear and the bookstore for maps and field guides. Lake Tahoe was a tourist destination, but it was also a working community where newcomers could blend in without attracting unwanted attention. Roman had established a new identity for both of them, legitimate documents obtained through contacts in military intelligence, complete with background histories that would survive casual investigation. To their neighbors, they were Marcus and David Wells, a retired veteran, and his son, starting over after a family tragedy. At the grocery store, they encountered Patty McGowan, a local teacher who'd befriended Luke during his first weeks at the new school. She was a woman in her 30s with red hair and freckles, divorced with no children of her own, but a natural affinity for young people. Luke, she called out, approaching with a cart full of school supplies. Are you ready for the science fair next month? Working on it, Luke replied with a grin. Dad's helping me build a weather monitoring station with remote sensors. That sounds ambitious. Will you be entering the regional competition if you win locally? Roman watched the interaction with quiet satisfaction. Luke was building new relationships, forming connections that had nothing to do with the trauma he'd experienced. The boy was healing, growing stronger, becoming the person he was meant to be before betrayal and violence had tried to break him. That evening, they sat on the deck watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. Luke was reading a novel, science fiction this time, about exploration and discovery in distant galaxies. Roman worked on cleaning his fishing equipment, the routine maintenance that kept gear reliable and functional. Dad, Luke's voice was thoughtful. Do you think about her? About Mom? Roman set down the reel he'd been cleaning and considered the question. Sometimes, he admitted, I think about the woman I married, the person she was before everything went wrong. But that person doesn't exist anymore, Luke. People change, and sometimes they change into someone you can't recognize or forgive. Do you hate her? No, Roman said truthfully. Hate requires energy I'd rather spend on more important things, like making sure you grow up to be a good man who makes good choices. Luke nodded, processing this information with the careful consideration that had become his habit when discussing difficult topics. I don't want to see her again, he said quietly. Even when I'm older, even if she gets out of prison. Is that wrong? Roman moved to sit beside his son, putting an arm around the boy's shoulders. That's not wrong, Luke. That's self-preservation. You don't owe forgiveness to someone who hurt you, no matter what relationship you used to have with them. Some betrayals are unforgivable, and some bridges can't be rebuilt once they're burned. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell over the lake, father and son united by shared experience and mutual loyalty. In the distance, a loon called across the water, its voice echoing off the surrounding mountains like a promise of wilderness and freedom. Roman McKinney had completed his final mission. He'd protected his son, eliminated his enemies, and built a new life from the ashes of betrayal. The soldier was finally at peace, his duty done and his honor intact. Some men fought for country, others for ideology or glory. Roman had fought for something simpler and more important: the right of a father to protect his child and the obligation to make betrayers pay for their crimes. In the end, that was enough. That was everything. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, Before the Storm. Vincent "Vinny" Delacroix had built his life on precision. At 38, he owned 3 successful auto repair shops across Portland, employing 27 people who respected him not just as a boss, but as a man who kept his word. His hands, permanently stained with motor oil despite countless scrubbing, were steady hands that could rebuild an engine blindfolded or gently bandage his son's scraped knee with equal expertise. Growing up in the foster system had taught Vinny that family wasn't about blood. It was about choice, loyalty, and showing up when it mattered. When he met Diane Roswell at a community college night class 15 years ago, she seemed to understand that philosophy. She was studying to be a dental hygienist, working double shifts at a diner to pay her way through school. Her determination matched his own, and when she laughed at his terrible jokes about carburetors, he knew he'd found his person. Their son Trevor came 3 years later, a boy with Vinny's dark hair and Diane's infectious smile. Trevor inherited his father's mechanical curiosity, spending countless Saturday mornings in the shop, learning to identify tools and asking endless questions about how things worked. At 14, he could change oil and check brake pads better than most adults. Diane had evolved from the driven student into someone different over the years. Success had come easily after graduation. Dr. Manning's dental practice hired her immediately, and her natural charm with patients made her indispensable. But success bred entitlement. She began working late more often, joining the dental office's social circle, attending conferences that stretched into long weekends. The first crack in their foundation came when Trevor was diagnosed with leukemia at age 13. Vinny immediately reorganized his entire business, promoting his most trusted mechanic, Lou Garrett, to manager so he could spend maximum time at the hospital. He learned every detail of Trevor's treatment, befriended the nurses, and turned the sterile hospital room into a makeshift workshop where he and Trevor designed impossible cars and dreamed about cross-country road trips they'd take when Trevor got better. Diane, however, seemed to retreat. She showed up for the major appointments and the serious conversations with doctors, but she couldn't handle the day-to-day grind of illness. She'd arrive with flowers and cheerful smiles, stay for an hour, then leave for urgent work matters. Vinny understood grief manifested differently in everyone, so he carried the weight alone, sleeping in hospital chairs and advocating fiercely for his son's care. When Trevor died 8 months later, just 2 weeks shy of his 15th birthday, Vinny felt like someone had reached into his chest and torn out everything that mattered. The funeral was held on a rainy Thursday in March. Vinny delivered the eulogy, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. He talked about Trevor's curiosity, his kindness, his dreams of designing cars that would help people. He promised his son that his memory would live on in every engine Vinny repaired, every person he helped. But even in his grief, Vinny noticed things. Diane's phone buzzing constantly during the service. Her frequent trips to the bathroom. The way she barely cried. while Vinny could hardly breathe through his tears. He attributed it to her way of processing loss. Everyone grieved differently, he told himself. She needed space, and he needed to honor that. The wake was held at their home, a modest 3-bedroom house that Vinny had renovated himself room by room. Friends from the shop, customers who'd become family, neighbors, and Trevor's friends filled every corner. People shared stories about Trevor, how he'd helped Mrs. Patterson next door fix her lawnmower, how he'd organized a car wash to raise money for the animal shelter, how he'd always had a smile and a bad dad joke ready. Vinny moved through the crowd, accepting condolences and making sure everyone had food and drinks. It was easier to take care of others than to sit still with his own pain. But as the evening wore on and the last guest trickled out, he realized he hadn't seen Diane for the last hour. He found her in their bedroom, not crying or processing grief, but carefully applying makeup and styling her hair. When he asked if she was okay, she barely looked at him. "I need some air," she said. "I'm going for a drive." She didn't come home that night. Chapter 2. The Unthinkable. Diane returned the next morning with coffee and bagels, acting as if staying out all night after her son's funeral was perfectly normal. When Vinny asked where she'd been, she claimed she'd driven to the coast and slept in her car, needing space to think. The explanation fell hollow, but Vinny was drowning in his own grief and desperate to believe anything that meant his wife was still the woman he'd married. The following week passed in a blur of thank you cards, insurance paperwork, and the overwhelming silence that filled the house where Trevor's laughter used to echo. Vinny threw himself into physical tasks, reorganizing Trevor's room, fixing everything that needed repair around the house, working 16-hour days at the shop. Movement kept the worst of the grief at bay. Diane, meanwhile, seemed oddly energized. She cleaned obsessively, rearranged furniture, and talked about fresh starts and new chapters. When Vinny suggested they might want to talk to a grief counselor together, she dismissed the idea, claiming work was therapy enough. 2 weeks after the funeral, on a cold Tuesday evening, Vinny came home early from the shop, exhausted and hoping to convince Diane to order takeout and maybe watch a movie together. They needed to start rebuilding their connection, finding ways to support each other through this impossible loss. Instead, he found Diane in the kitchen with a man he'd never seen before. Tall and lean with carefully styled blonde hair and expensive clothes, the stranger was leaning against Vinny's counter, drinking Vinny's beer, while Diane giggled like a teenager. "Vinny," Diane's voice was bright but artificial. "This is Rick Chandler. He's the new dental technician at the office. I invited him for dinner." Rick extended a manicured hand and a politician's smile. "Sorry for your loss, man. Diane's told me all about your son. Real tragedy." The casual way this stranger referenced Trevor, his son, his boy, his heart, made Vinny's blood freeze. But he shook the offered hand and muttered appropriate pleasantries, confusion overriding anger. Maybe Diane had invited a work friend over to distract herself. Maybe this was her way of coping. Dinner was surreal. Rick dominated the conversation, sharing anecdotes about his previous job in Los Angeles, his plans to elevate the practice's technology, and his philosophy about living life to the fullest. He spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, and treated Vinny with the polite condescension one might show a simple tradesman. What disturbed Vinny most was how Diane responded, laughing too loudly at Rick's jokes, touching his arm when she made points, and acting like a different person entirely. This wasn't the woman who used to fall asleep reading dental journals, or who got excited about new techniques for cleaning stubborn plaque. This was someone performing, and Vinny couldn't understand for whose benefit. After Rick left around 10 p.m., with promises to do this again soon, Vinny tried to talk to Diane about how strange the evening had felt. She accused him of being jealous and antisocial, claiming she was just trying to maintain normal relationships while he wallowed in his grief. "Maybe if you made an effort to move forward instead of treating our house like a shrine, we could start healing," she said before disappearing into the bathroom for an hour-long shower. Over the next few days, Rick's presence became a regular occurrence. He showed up for dinner Wednesday, stopped by Saturday afternoon to check on Diane, and called the house at odd hours. When Vinny answered, Rick would ask for Diane with the familiarity of an old friend, not a recent colleague. Sunday morning, Vinny woke to find Diane already dressed and applying makeup. Rick's picking me up for brunch, she announced. The whole office crew is going to that new place downtown. But when Vinny called the office later to speak with Diane about Trevor's memorial fund, the receptionist mentioned that Dr. Manning was at his daughter's soccer game, and most of the staff had the weekend off. When he asked about Rick Chandler, there was a long pause. I'm sorry, we don't have anyone by that name working here. Vinny hung up the phone, his hands shaking not from grief, but from a terrible understanding beginning to dawn. Chapter 3. The Slap That Changed Everything. That Sunday night, Vinny waited in the dark living room for Diane to return from her supposed office brunch. She came home at nearly midnight, humming softly and moving with the loose contentment of someone who'd had an excellent day. How was brunch? Vinny asked from the shadows. Diane jumped, then laughed nervously. God, you scared me. It was nice. We went to that place on Burnside, then walked around the waterfront. I called the office today, Vinny said quietly. There's no Rick Chandler working there. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, Vinny watched his wife's face cycle through surprise, calculation, and finally defiance. You call my work to check up on me? Her voice rose with practiced indignation. What's wrong with you? Diane, who is Rick Chandler? She turned away, busying herself with hanging up her jacket. He was a consultant. He finished his contract this week. Stop lying to me. The words hung in the air between them. Vinny had never spoken to her like that before. Direct, uncompromising, demanding truth. In their 15 years together, he'd always given her the benefit of the doubt, always chosen to trust rather than question. Diane turned back to face him, and for a moment, he saw something in her expression he'd never seen before, something cold and calculating. Fine, she said. You want the truth? Rick is someone who makes me feel alive again. Someone who doesn't want to spend every waking moment mourning the past. Our son died 3 weeks ago. I know when my son died, she snapped. But life goes on, Vinny. Some of us want to live it. How long? His voice was barely above a whisper. Does it matter? How long, Diane? She stared at him for a long moment, then shrugged with a casualness that felt like a physical blow. 6 months. We met at a dental conference in Seattle. He was representing an equipment company. 6 months. While Trevor was fighting for his life. While Vinny was sleeping in hospital chairs and learning about white blood cell counts and chemotherapy protocols. While their son was asking why Mommy seemed so distracted during her visits. You've been seeing him since Trevor was sick? Don't make this about Trevor, Diane said, her voice hardening. This is about you and me. About how we grew apart. About how you became so obsessed with being the perfect grieving father that you forgot you had a wife. I forgot I had a wife. Vinny stood up, his control finally cracking. I was trying to save our son. And what about saving our marriage? The question hit him like a slap. How could she twist his dedication to their dying child into a failure as a husband? How could she make her betrayal his fault? Get out, he said quietly. What? I said get out. Pack a bag and leave. Diane laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. This is my house too, Vinny. Half of everything we built together. You can't just 2 weeks after my son's funeral, my wife brought her new lover to live with us, Vinny said, his voice growing stronger. When I spoke up, she acted like I was the problem. Now I'm saying get out. Rick's not moving in, Diane said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't he? Because it seems like he's been here every day this week. Drinking my beer, eating my food, sleeping in my bed when I'm not here. Her face flushed. You don't know what you're talking about. Then prove me wrong. Choose. Him or me. The silence that followed was answer enough. Diane straightened her shoulders and looked at him with something approaching pity. You're living in the past, Vinny. Trevor's gone, and no amount of your obsessive grief is going to bring him back. Rick helps me focus on the future. On your future, Vinny corrected. On your life without the inconvenience of a grieving husband. If you can't handle. Just 2 weeks after my son's funeral, my wife brought her new lover to live with us. When I spoke up, she slapped me hard and shouted, If you can't handle it, get out. I left with nothing, and no one cared. Those weren't his words. They were the words he'd write years later, in court documents and victim impact statements. But in that moment, watching his wife choose her affair over their marriage while their son's memorial flowers were still fresh, Vinny saw his future with perfect clarity. Diane raised her hand and slapped him hard across the face. The sound echoed through their living room like a gunshot. "If you can't handle it, get out," she shouted. Vinny felt something inside him die that had nothing to do with grief. This was different from losing Trevor. That had been a cruel act of nature, a medical tragedy that no one could control. This was betrayal, deliberate and calculated and chosen. He looked at his wife of 15 years, the mother of his dead son, and felt something new taking root where his trust used to live. Something cold and patient and absolutely unforgiving. "Okay," he said quietly, touching his stinging cheek. "I'll go." He packed a single bag and left that night. He didn't look back. Chapter 4. The Descent. Vinny moved into a studio apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant on Division Street. The place smelled like pho and motor oil from the auto shop next door, since it reminded him of his old life without the painful memories attached to his house. The apartment came furnished with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and nothing else. It was perfect. He had no desire for comfort. The first month was a blur of legal consultations and sleepless nights. Diane had immediately filed for divorce and temporary spousal support, claiming Vinny had abandoned the marriage. Her lawyer, a sharp woman named Beverly Morse, painted a picture of a controlling husband who couldn't handle his wife's need for social support during their mutual grief. Vinny's court-appointed attorney, an overworked public defender named Tim Walsh, was competent but overwhelmed. During their first meeting, Walsh delivered the harsh reality. Oregon was a no-fault divorce state. Diane's affair wouldn't impact the division of assets significantly, and her request for spousal support had merit given her lower income. But she was cheating while our son was dying, Vinny protested. "I understand your anger," Walsh replied, "but the court focuses on financial need, not moral judgments. She makes $45,000 as a dental hygienist. You own 3 businesses worth approximately $2 million combined. The math is simple." What Walsh didn't know, what nobody knew except Lou Garrett, Vinny's most trusted employee, was that the businesses were leveraged to the breaking point. Vinny had borrowed heavily against all 3 shops to pay for Trevor's experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. They'd flown to Houston for a clinical trial, to Seattle for a specialist consultation, to Mexico for an alternative therapy that cost $30,000 out of pocket. Every penny had been worth it for the chance to save his son. But now, facing the prospect of liquidating his life's work to pay Diane's spousal support while she lived with her lover, Vinny felt the full weight of his financial reality. The shops were breaking even, but barely. The debt service ate up most of the profit, and without Vinny's daily management, small problems were becoming expensive repairs. Lou was talented, but inexperienced with the business side. Customers were starting to drift away, sensing the instability. Diane, meanwhile, wasn't content to wait for the divorce settlement. 3 weeks after Vinny moved out, she showed up at his apartment with Rick in tow. They waited in the parking lot until Vinny came home from work, then approached him together. "We need to talk," Diane announced. Rick stood slightly behind her, wearing an expensive suit and the satisfied expression of a man who'd won something valuable. "No hard feelings, right, buddy? These things happen." Vinny looked at the man who was living in his house, sleeping in his bed, probably sitting in Trevor's room, sorting through the belongings of a dead boy he'd never met. "What do you want?" "I'm willing to buy out your share of the house," Rick said, pulling out a folded paper. "I've had it appraised. Market value is $420. I'll give you $210 cash today. Clean break." The house was worth closer to $500,000. Vinny had spent years renovating it himself, but it was also mortgaged for $350. Rick's offer would leave him with virtually nothing after paying off the loan. "That's generous," Diane added, not meeting Vinny's eyes. "It would solve a lot of problems for both of us." Vinny studied the paper, buying time while his mind worked. Rick's confidence suggested he had resources, real resources, the kind that didn't come from a dental technician's salary. "I'll think about it," Vinny said finally. "Don't think too long." Rick replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The offer won't stay on the table forever." After they left, Vinny sat in his sparse apartment and began to plan. Not the emotional reaction they expected, not the desperate moves of a broken man, but the methodical preparation of someone who understood that revenge was a dish best served with infinite patience. He called in favors from old customers, men who owed him money or time or loyalty. Within a week, he knew Rick Chandler's real story. Rick wasn't a dental technician. He was a professional grifter who specialized in targeting recently widowed or divorced women with assets. His real name was Robert Christopher Henley, and he had a history spanning 3 states. He'd married a widow in Phoenix and disappeared with her life insurance money. He'd convinced a divorced teacher in Sacramento to refinance her house and vanished with the proceeds. He was good at what he did, patient, charming, and utterly without conscience. Diane wasn't his first mark in Portland, just his most recent. He was living off her income while setting up his next score. The expensive clothes, the cash offer on the house, it was all part of the con. He was positioning himself to control Diane's assets, then disappear when the timing was right. The knowledge should have motivated Vinny to warn his wife, to try to save her from becoming another victim. Instead, he felt something different: opportunity. If Rick was a predator, then Diane had chosen to become prey. She destroyed their marriage for a man who was planning to destroy her. The poetic justice was almost beautiful. But Vinny's plans went deeper than simply watching his wife get conned. Rick had made one crucial mistake. He'd threatened Vinny directly, treated him like a fool to be easily disposed of. That required a response. And 8 years later, when Vinny finally stood before them in court, what he did that day would make them understand exactly how costly that mistake had been. Chapter 5: The Long Game. For 6 months, Vinny played the part of the defeated ex-husband perfectly. He agreed to the divorce terms, signed over half the house value to Diane, and took a modest settlement that left him with enough to keep one auto shop running. To everyone watching, including Diane and Rick, he appeared broken and financially ruined. In reality, he was building. The Vietnamese restaurant owner below his apartment, Mrs. Nguyen, had a son who was a computer programmer and a gambling problem. When Andy Nguyen owed the wrong people $12,000, Vinny paid the debt in exchange for certain services. Andy was talented with technology and desperate enough to avoid asking too many questions about his new employer's requests. Vinny also cultivated a relationship with Jimmy the Fish Torino, a small-time bookie who ran numbers out of a barbershop on the east side. Jimmy owed Vinny $3,000 for transmission work on his Cadillac, and Vinny offered to forgive the debt in exchange for information and occasional assistance with matters that required discretion. Most importantly, Vinny reconnected with Marcus Wade, his cellmate during a brief stint in county jail 15 years earlier. Marcus had been inside for burglary, Vinny for a bar fight that went too far. They'd bonded over a shared understanding that the system was rigged against men like them, and they'd stayed in touch after release. Marcus now ran a successful private security company, the kind that asked few questions about their assignments. The plan Vinny conceived was elegant in its complexity. He wouldn't simply expose Rick's con or try to save Diane from her own choices. Instead, he would orchestrate a scenario where Rick's past victims would have their justice. Diane would face consequences for her betrayal, and Vinny would emerge with everything he'd lost, plus interest. Phase 1 involved documenting Rick's activities with methodical precision. Andy Nguyen installed tracking software on Rick's phone, hacked his email accounts, and monitored his financial transactions. Jimmy Torino spread word through his network that someone was asking questions about Rick Chandler, forcing Rick to pay attention to potential threats from his past. Within 3 months, Vinny had a complete picture of Rick's operation. The man was even more dangerous than initial investigation had revealed. He wasn't just conning women. He was running identity theft schemes, credit card fraud, and small-scale money laundering. He used each Mark's home as a base of operations, then moved on when the heat got too close. Diane, meanwhile, was being systematically isolated from her friends and family. Rick convinced her that people were jealous of their happiness, that Vinny was spreading lies about him, that she needed to cut ties with anyone who didn't support their relationship. He took control of her finances gradually, convincing her to add his name to her accounts for convenience, then making investments and purchases without her knowledge. By winter, Diane had lost contact with most of her social circle and was completely dependent on Rick financially and emotionally. To outsiders, they looked like a happy couple. In reality, she was being groomed for a larger theft. Phase 2 began when Vinny made his first move against Rick's operation. Using information from Andy's surveillance, he anonymously tipped the FBI to Rick's credit card fraud schemes. Not enough to get him arrested immediately, but enough to put him under investigation. Simultaneously, Marcus Wade began reaching out to Rick's previous victims through the private investigator network. Instead of simply gathering information, they offered these women something unprecedented, a chance for justice and restitution. Vinny was building a coalition of Iran, funded by the money he'd secretly saved by living in poverty while maintaining the appearance of a struggling ex-husband. Every woman Rick had destroyed would have the opportunity to confront him together, with resources and legal support they'd never had individually. But the centerpiece of Vinny's plan was more personal. Through Andy's monitoring, he discovered that Rick was planning to marry Diane in Las Vegas during the spring. After the wedding, he would convince her to take out a massive home equity loan against the house that was half Vinny's under the divorce settlement. Then he would disappear with the money, leaving Diane bankrupt and Vinny legally responsible for half the debt. It was a brilliant scam, and it would have worked against a normal ex-husband. But Vinny wasn't normal anymore. Trevor's death had burned away everything soft and trusting in him. Diane's betrayal had taught him that loyalty was a weakness others would exploit. He'd become something new, patient, calculating, and utterly without mercy for those who'd chosen to be his enemies. The wedding was set for April 15th. Vinny had 6 months to complete his preparations. On a snowy evening in January, exactly 1 year after Trevor's death, Vinny sat in his sparse apartment and wrote a letter to his son. He told Trevor about the plan, about the justice that was coming, about how sometimes being a good man meant doing terrible things to terrible people. He sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it in his safe deposit box, along with documentation of every crime Rick had committed and every step of Vinny's investigation. If something happened to him, Marcus Wade had instructions to deliver everything to the FBI and the media. But Vinny didn't intend for anything to happen to him. He intended to be very much alive to watch Rick and Diane face the consequences of their choices. 8 years later, when he finally stood before them in court, they would learn what those consequences were. Chapter 6. The Perfect Storm. As Rick and Diane's Vegas wedding approached, Vinny's network moved into position like pieces on a chessboard. Everything had to happen simultaneously to prevent Rick from escaping or destroying evidence. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday, April 15th. On Wednesday the 12th, Vinny received confirmation that all elements were ready. Rick's previous victims, 7 women from 4 states, had been secretly organized into a coordinated legal assault. Each had filed civil suits in their respective jurisdictions, all scheduled to be served simultaneously on Monday morning. The FBI had built an airtight case for federal fraud charges, waiting only for Rick to commit his next major crime to justify a high-profile arrest. Most importantly, Andy and Gwen had discovered Rick's exit strategy. He maintained 3 separate identities with corresponding bank accounts and credit cards. On April 20th, 5 days after the wedding, he planned to transfer the home equity loan money to an offshore account, then vanish using a passport in the name of Michael Thompson. Diane knew nothing about any of this. She was planning their wedding with the excitement of a woman who believed she'd found her soulmate. Vinny watched through surveillance photos as she shopped for a dress, chose flowers, and called venues. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. She was planning the celebration of her own destruction. Friday night, April 14th, Vinny flew to Las Vegas. He checked into the Bellagio under an assumed name, 2 floors above the suite where Rick and Diane would spend their wedding night. Marcus Wade was already in position with a surveillance team. Jimmy Torino had arrived with 2 associates who specialized in what he called aggressive debt collection. The wedding was held at a tacky chapel on the Strip, attended only by Diane and Rick plus 2 witnesses they had hired from service. Vinny watched from across the street, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, feeling nothing as his ex-wife pledged her love to a man who was planning to destroy her life. After the ceremony, Rick and Diane had dinner at an expensive restaurant in their hotel. Vinny could have crashed their celebration, could have warned Diane what was coming, could have given her one last chance to walk away. Instead, he returned to his room and waited. At 2:47 a.m., Marcus Wade called with confirmation. Rick had accessed his computer and begun the process of setting up the home equity loan. He was working with a corrupt mortgage broker in Portland who specialized in fast approvals for clients who asked no questions. By Monday, Rick would have a check for $350,000, money secured by Diane's house and Vinny's legal liability as co-owner. At 3:15 a.m., Vinny made a phone call that would change everything. "This is Agent Sarah Mitchell." The FBI agent answered on the first ring. "It's time," Vinny said simply. "Are you certain? Once we move, there's no going back." "I'm certain. The arrest will happen Monday morning when he attempts to deposit the check. Are you prepared for the fallout?" Vinny looked out his hotel window at the lights of Las Vegas, thinking about Trevor, about the betrayal that had destroyed his marriage, about the years of careful planning that had led to this moment. "I've been prepared for 8 years. Monday morning, April 18th, Rick drove to his corrupt mortgage broker's office in Northeast Portland to finalize the home equity loan. He was dressed in an expensive suit, carrying a briefcase, and driving Diane's BMW. He believed he was 96 hours away from disappearing forever with enough money to start fresh somewhere else. Instead, he walked into the largest federal fraud sting operation in Oregon state history. The mortgage broker's office had been under FBI surveillance for 6 months. Rick's arrival with fraudulent documentation and identity papers was the final piece of evidence they needed. As he signed the loan papers that would steal Diane's house and destroy her credit, federal agents burst through the doors with weapons drawn. "Robert Christopher Henley, you're under arrest for federal fraud, identity theft, and money laundering." Rick's first instinct was to run. His second was to claim innocence. His third was to demand a lawyer. All 3 failed. The evidence against him filled 14 boxes: surveillance footage, financial records, testimony from previous victims, and digital forensics that traced every crime back to its source. Andy Nguyen's computer work had been thorough enough to impress the FBI's own cybercrimes unit. But the real surprise came when the agents also arrested the mortgage broker, 2 bank officials, and a real estate attorney who'd been facilitating Rick's schemes. Vinny's investigation had uncovered an entire network of corruption that the FBI had been hunting for years. As Rick was being processed into federal custody, Diane was served with civil suits from 7 different women seeking restitution for crimes committed by her new husband. She was also informed that her marriage was invalid. Rick's previous marriage in Arizona had never been legally dissolved. By Tuesday morning, Diane's world had completely collapsed. Her husband was a federal fugitive who'd been using her identity for fraud. Her house was in foreclosure due to mortgage irregularities. Her bank accounts were frozen pending investigation, and she had no one to call for help because Rick had convinced her to cut ties with everyone who'd ever cared about her. Everyone except Vinny. Chapter 7. The Reckoning Begins. Diane called Vinny from a payphone outside the federal courthouse on Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was small and broken, nothing like the confident woman who'd slapped him and demanded he leave his own home. "They took everything," she said without preamble. "The house, the cars, my bank accounts. They say they say he was married to someone else. That nothing we did was legal." Vinny listened without speaking, standing in his auto shop office where he'd returned to rebuild his life one customer at a time. Through the window, he could see Lou Garrett training a new mechanic, the business finally thriving again after years of careful growth. "I need help," Diane continued. "I don't have anywhere to go. No money for a lawyer. The FBI wants me to testify, but they won't tell me if I'm in trouble too." "What do you want from me?" Vinny asked quietly. I don't know. I call my sister, but she won't talk to me. My friends from work say they can't get involved. You're the only person who..." The only person who what? The only person who might not hate me enough to hang up. Vinny closed his eyes, remembering the night she'd chosen Rick over their marriage. The sound of her palm striking his face, the years of silence that followed. Why would I help you? Because I know I destroyed everything. Because I was wrong about Rick, wrong about us, wrong about everything. Because her voice broke. Because Trevor would want you to. The mention of their son hit like a physical blow. Diane had lost the right to invoke Trevor's memory the night she chose her affair over her family. But she was desperate enough to try anyway. Meet me at Denny's on Powell Boulevard in an hour, Vinny said. Come alone. She was waiting in a corner booth when he arrived, looking smaller and older than he remembered. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled. Her makeup was smeared from crying, and her hands shook as she held her coffee cup. For a moment, Vinny felt a flicker of the old sympathy he'd once felt for her. Then he remembered Trevor asking why Mommy seemed sad during her hospital visits, not knowing his mother was distracted by text messages from her lover. I need you to know something, Vinny said, sliding into the booth across from her. I've known about Rick for 3 years. Diane's eyes widened. What? I knew he was a con man. I knew about the other women, the fake identities, the financial crimes. I knew he was planning to steal your house and disappear. Then why didn't you warn me? Vinny studied her face, looking for any trace of the woman he'd once loved. Because you made your choice. When you slapped me and told me to get out. When you chose him over our marriage, you chose whatever came next. But you could have saved me from this. Could I? Vinny leaned forward. What would you have done if I'd called you 3 years ago and told you Rick was a criminal? Would you have believed me? Or would you have accused me of lying because I was jealous? Diane's silence was answer enough. You threw away 15 years of marriage for a man you'd known 6 months, Vinny continued. You brought him into our house while our son's memory was still fresh. You chose to trust a stranger over your husband. So I let you live with the consequences of that choice. You let me get conned. I let you get exactly what you were looking for, a life without me in it. Diane started crying again, the ugly, desperate sobs of someone who'd lost everything through her own choices. What am I supposed to do now? Vinny pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table between them. Rick's real name is Robert Christopher Henley. He's been running cons for 15 years. The FBI has evidence of fraud in 6 states. His previous victims are suing him for millions. How do you know all this? Because I've been documenting his crimes since the week he moved into our house. Every financial transaction, every fake identity, every woman he's destroyed. I've been building a case against him for 8 years. Diane stopped crying, staring at him with growing comprehension. You planned this. You set him up. I gave him enough rope to hang himself. Rick destroyed his own life by being exactly who he was. I just made sure there were consequences. But what about me? I didn't know. You knew enough, Vinny interrupted. You knew I called his work and discovered he didn't exist. You knew his story kept changing. You knew he was pushing you to cut ties with everyone who cared about you. You chose to ignore every red flag because you wanted what he was selling. He stood up to leave, then paused. The FBI will probably offer you immunity if you cooperate fully. Tell them everything. When you met him, what he told you, how he controlled your finances. Help them build the strongest possible case. Why are you telling me this? Vinny looked down at the broken woman who'd once been his wife and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Because I want Rick to spend the maximum possible time in federal prison. And I want you to live with knowing that you chose him over us. He walked away, leaving her alone with the wreckage of the life she'd chosen. But the reckoning was far from over. Chapter 8. The Trial of Consequences. Rick's federal trial began 14 months later, in June of the following year. By then, the case had grown into one of the largest fraud prosecutions in Oregon history. 7 victims testified about how Rick had systematically destroyed their lives. The FBI presented evidence of over $2 million in theft across multiple states. Financial experts explained the sophisticated laundering schemes he'd used to hide his crimes. But the prosecution's most devastating witness was Diane herself. She testified for 3 days, describing in excruciating detail how Rick had manipulated her emotions, isolated her from support systems, and gradually taken control of her finances. Her testimony was compelling precisely because she wasn't trying to excuse her own behavior. She admitted to every poor choice, every ignored warning sign, every moment when she'd chosen to trust Rick over her own instincts. The defense tried to paint her as a willing accomplice, but the evidence was overwhelming. Rick had run the same con on 7 other women, using identical tactics and manipulation strategies. Diane was a victim, even if she'd made herself an easy target through her own selfishness and poor judgment. Vinny attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back of the courtroom like a silent witness to justice. He watched Rick try to charm the jury, watched him blame his victims for their gullibility, watched him show no remorse for the devastation he'd caused. When the guilty verdict was read, guilty on all 23 federal counts, Rick finally lost his composure. He screamed at the judge that he'd been framed, that his victims were liars, that the system was corrupt. U.S. Marshals had to physically restrain him as he was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. After the sentencing, Diane approached Vinny in the courthouse hallway. She'd spent the past year working as a cashier at a grocery store, living in a studio apartment, and attending court-mandated financial counseling. The experience had aged her, but there was something different in her eyes, a humility that hadn't been there before. "I know you'll never forgive me," she said quietly, "but I wanted to thank you for giving me the information I needed to help convict him." "I didn't do it for you," Vinny replied. "I did it for justice. I know. I also know that you could have destroyed me completely if you'd wanted to. The fact that you didn't. Don't mistake necessity for mercy," Vinny cut her off. "You were useful to the prosecution. That's the only reason you're not in federal prison yourself." Diane nodded, accepting the harsh truth. "What happens now? Now you live with the consequences of your choices, just like I've lived with mine." She started to walk away, then turned back. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if things had been different? If I'd chosen you instead of him?" Vinny considered the question seriously. "No," he said finally, "because the woman who would have chosen me over him wouldn't have been having an affair in the first place." After Diane left, Vinny remained in the courthouse for another hour, thinking about justice and revenge and the difference between the two. Rick would spend the next 18 years in federal prison, where his charm and manipulation skills would be useless. His victims would receive restitution from seized assets, though money could never fully repair the damage he'd done. But for Vinny, the real victory wasn't Rick's imprisonment. It was the knowledge that he'd transformed his rage and grief into something purposeful. He'd taken the worst betrayal of his life and turned it into justice for people who'd never expected to see any. That evening, he drove to Riverside Cemetery and sat beside Trevor's grave. The headstone was simple: Trevor James Delacroix, beloved son, dreamer of impossible cars. "It's finished," he said aloud. "The man who hurt our family is in prison. The woman who betrayed us is living with the consequences." Justice was served. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Vinny could almost hear his son's voice. "Good job, Dad." But what happens next? What happened next was the question that would define the rest of Vinny's life. He'd spent 8 years planning and executing the perfect revenge. Now, he had to decide what to do with the rest of his time on Earth. As he drove home to his small apartment above the Vietnamese restaurant, Vinny made a decision that would surprise everyone who thought they knew him. But that story would unfold in the final chapter of his transformation from grieving father to something much more dangerous. Chapter 9. 8 years later. The courtroom was packed on a gray November morning 8 years after Rick's conviction. Vinny sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing an expensive suit and the confident bearing of a man who'd rebuilt his life from ashes. Across the aisle, Diane sat with her court-appointed attorney, looking tired and defeated. Between them sat the reason for this final confrontation: Kyle Morrison, Rick's former cellmate who'd been released from federal prison 6 months earlier. Kyle had tracked down Diane with a story about Rick's secret stash of money hidden before his arrest. According to Kyle, Rick had told him about $300,000 buried in a storage unit, money that rightfully belonged to his wife. All Diane had to do was pay Kyle $50,000 for the location, and she could reclaim the hidden fortune. It was, of course, another con. Kyle was a career criminal who specialized in preying on previous fraud victims, using information gathered from fellow inmates to run secondary scams. He'd approached dozens of Rick's victims with similar stories, collecting finder's fees for treasure that didn't exist. But Kyle had made a critical error in targeting Diane. He'd underestimated how thoroughly Vinny had documented every aspect of Rick's criminal operation. "Your Honor," Vinny's attorney began, "8 years ago, my client discovered that his wife was having an affair with a career criminal. Rather than simply divorce her, Mr. Delacroix spent years building a federal case that resulted in the conviction of Robert Henley and the recovery of over $2 million for his victims." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, reviewed the case file with obvious interest. This wasn't a typical civil matter. Mr. Delacroix maintained surveillance on Mr. Henley's operation for 3 years before the arrest, the attorney continued. During that time, he documented every financial transaction, every hidden asset, every criminal contact. "There is no secret stash of money because my client accounted for every dollar Rick Henley stole." Kyle's attorney, a public defender who clearly wished he was anywhere else, made a weak argument about new evidence and recovered assets. But when Vinny's team presented 8 years of financial records, surveillance footage, and FBI cooperation agreements, Kyle's story collapsed completely. More damaging was the revelation that Kyle had been working this same scam across multiple states, targeting at least 30 victims with promises of hidden money that never existed. The FBI had been building a case against him, and his attempt to defraud Diane provided the final evidence they needed. But the real surprise came when the judge asked why Vinny was pursuing this case so aggressively. "Mr. Delacroix," she said, "you've already seen Mr. Henley convicted and imprisoned. Your ex-wife's financial situation isn't legally your responsibility. Why invest significant resources in stopping this relatively small fraud?" Vinny stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Diane's face. "Your Honor, 8 years ago, my wife chose to destroy our marriage for a criminal who was planning to steal her life savings. I could have warned her, could have saved her from becoming a victim. Instead, I let her experience the full consequences of trusting the wrong person." The courtroom was completely silent. "I thought that would be enough," Vinny continued. "I thought watching her lose everything would satisfy my need for justice. But I was wrong. The real lesson wasn't about the consequences of betrayal. It was about the difference between justice and revenge." He gestured toward Kyle. "This man is a predator who targets people when they're most vulnerable. He specifically chose my ex-wife because he believed she was an easy mark, someone who'd already proven she could be manipulated by criminals." Vinny's voice grew harder. "I spent 8 years documenting Rick Henley's crimes not just for revenge, but to protect his future victims. Today, I'm here to ensure that Mr. Morrison faces consequences for his crimes, and that no one else falls victim to his scams." The judge studied Vinny for a long moment. "And what about your ex-wife? What consequences does she face in your version of justice?" "She faces the same consequence she's faced for 8 years, Your Honor. She has to live with the knowledge that her choices destroyed everything we built together, including our son's memory of a united family." For the first time during the proceedings, Diane spoke up. "Our son died before any of this happened. Don't use Trevor's memory to justify. Don't." Vinny's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Don't you dare invoke our son's name. You were cheating on our marriage while he was dying. You brought your lover into our house 2 weeks after we buried him. You chose your affair over Trevor's memory, and you chose it again every day for 8 years. Diane stood up, tears streaming down her face. "I know I was wrong. I know I destroyed everything. But holding on to this anger for 8 years, Trevor wouldn't want. Trevor would want his father to protect innocent people from predators," Vinny interrupted. "He would want justice for victims who can't fight for themselves. And he would want the people who betrayed his family to face real consequences, not just convenient forgiveness." The judge banged her gavel, restoring order. After reviewing the evidence, she ruled in Vinny's favor on all counts. Kyle Morrison was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for fraud. Diane was ordered to pay restitution for her role in attempting to access the non-existent hidden money. But more importantly, the judge ordered a full investigation into Kyle's other victims, potentially bringing justice to dozens of people who'd been scammed by Rick's former cellmate. As the courtroom cleared, Diane approached Vinny one final time. "When does it end?" she asked quietly. "When you finally let go of the anger?" Vinny looked at the woman who'd once been his wife, the mother of his dead son, the person who'd chosen betrayal over loyalty when he needed her most. "It ends when justice is served completely. When every